Is it possible, after all, that history has no sense? Does it make sense?
Well, a lot of people have thought that. Voltaire thought that history is the record of the crimes and absurdities of mankind. I thought that was a very unworthy definition. I should say that history is the record of the activities of mankind, and it has two sides. One is the crimes and absurdities, the other is the contributions to civilization, the lasting developments which enabled each generation to proceed with a larger heritage than the one before. And that, to me, is the meaning of history.
Well, turning to this book, The Lessons of History, that I have, I'm fascinated that the first chapter is marked Hesitations. You, in fact, ask a question that I would like to ask you. You say, of what use have your studies been? And you ask, what have you found in your work? Only the amusement of recounting the rise and fall of nations and ideas, and retelling the sad stories of the death of kings. Has it had meaning, in other words?
Well, the meaning of history is that it is man laid bare. You see, there are two ways of arriving at a large perspective, which would be a definition of philosophy, a large perspective. One is by studying the external world through science in all its aspects. You come to some general conclusion then, the way Herbert Spencer did, approaching it from that point of view as an engineer. The other is to examine how man has behaved for the last 6,000 or 10,000 years. And consequently, history becomes the best guide we have to what man is. And we have to presume that one of the lessons of history is that he continues to behave, basically, in each generation as he behaved in the generations before. His instincts are the same. The basic situations that he faces are the same. Naturally, he makes similar responses. He makes political organizations. He makes love affairs, marriages. He overeats in each generation and so forth. So that the present is the past rolled up for action. And the past is the present unrolled for understanding.
I'd like to hear how you got interested in history. What was it that made you get so interested in studying history?
Well, that's very interesting. I was interested in philosophy. And I studied it very faithfully, wrote a little book called The Story of Philosophy. And I found that I wasn't getting any answers that I wanted. I wanted to know what kind of a man is man. Philosophy didn't tell me. It is true that it attempted to deal with consciousness, which scientists never deal with. And yet it's the most astonishing thing in the world. But I discovered that to find out how man behaves and how he will probably behave in the future, you have to study history. That is the map of human character.
Dr. Durant, was it because he was so interested that you got interested, or were you interested before?
No, I was almost a child bride, you know. I was much younger, and it took me time to try and catch up to what he really was saying. So that when he talked, I most attentively listened. I knew that that was the beginning of my education. So I couldn't take credit for any of his early opinions. I didn't help make them, and it was a hard enough task to understand them.
It's her way of saying she is not responsible. Well, history is has a double meaning. It can be the events of the past, or it can be the record of the past. And consequently, that double meaning has confused us very often. the record of the past can have a great deal of significance, but the events themselves have significance only if you approach them from a philosophical standpoint and ask the right questions. Otherwise, it will be just the same thing all over again.
You also say history is a fragment of biology.
Yes, because we are animals living in conflict with an environment and in competition with thousands of other species. Think of the insects, which according to Time magazine will sooner or later get rid of the human species. You don't realize that from a biological standpoint, all the history of mankind is a very short chapter in the history of life. And that's a chapter in the history of the planet. You take Mars, apparently no life on it, but it's had a history.
You mentioned that the first biological lesson of history is that life is competition. That means our competition with the rest of the inhabitants of the Earth?
Yes, you see, I reject the Marxian theory of history, that history is the history of the class war. And that's only one part of the competitions of life. History is the activity of man in a struggle with other forms of life for the possibilities and gifts of the environment. And the competition is the basic law. Competition, as I put it once, is the trade of life as well as the life of trade. Okay? And consequently, the whole Marxian theory of history falls onto one little element in the biology of man.
There always has been a kind of birth control among nations, has there not?
Yes.
That's not new in history, then.
Well, it is new as a conscious social process and as groups of people deliberately organizing the control of population. But as a practice of man and wife, it is as old as history. And Caesar was already offering prizes for parents who had 3 children. And didn't do them any good. The difficulty was that the Romans obeyed him, and the non-native stocks that were immigrants into Italy did not obey him, and the Romans disappeared, and the non-natives inherited the earth.
One of my favorite lines of yours is that there is no humorist like history. Could you explain this?
You know, it often surprises us with the congruence of the incongruous. Now, let's see. How, for example, the most ignorant elements in the Roman Empire outlasted the educated Romans. See? Naturally, you would expect that the educated would inherit the earth. The fertile inherit the earth.
The fertile inherit the earth. What does that teach us?
Yes, it teaches the law of biology, that you have to breed as well as breathe.
Just how does biology influence the course of history?
Well, I suppose civilization exists with the permission of the survival of the race. If your civilization does not contain methods of survival, then it will not last very long.
And the survival of the fittest, the old Darwinian doctrine, still holds true.
Of course, we don't know what the word fit means. He defined it as really, when you boil it down to Darwin's conclusion, it was this, that living history or biology is a struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest to survive. How do you define fit? only in terms of survival again, see? So it's more or less a begging of the question, namely, what do you mean by fit?
Well, the hunter is a pretty vicious fellow.
Yes.
And a pretty uncivilized fellow.
Yes.
And yet is fit to survive in that environment.
He knew how to survive in that environment.
And the great nations of the world today, we call them great because they are powerful. They are fit to survive?
Well, so far they have proved fit to survive.
But also fit to destroy humankind as we know it through nuclear proliferation and other ways.
Yes. You see, competition used to be among individuals, and then it was enlarged. It was among families. Then it was enlarged among communities. Cooperation is a tool of competition. You cooperate within the community because the community itself is endangered and must have your cooperation in order to compete with other communities like us with Russia, see? And consequently, the basic reality is competition. And we can't get away with it. We have to accept it as probably not only the method of survival, but the secret of vitality. If you were not competing, what would make you develop?
So a certain degree of competition is inevitable and necessary.
Yes.
How do we account for man's dominance over the other species?
Intelligence, I presume. Maybe the fact that he was able to stand up helped. He could use his hands because the hands are the instrument of education in the early life. The child learns through his hands. And even the simple worker, he learns through his hands.
And was that dumb luck or was it the product? Where does the intelligence come from? That is the question.
The intelligence is not exactly the cause, it is the product. Namely, when a man experiments and finds that he can get his results by certain means, and then he uses those results. That is intelligence. It's not so much that he was intelligent. He becomes intelligent. And maybe the first part of the process is luck, accident.
So you don't see any distinct pattern in this, no inevitability. The role of accident is very prominent then in the progress or the development of man to his present estate?
Well, I should say its role diminishes in importance. Obviously, the role of education today in America is more important than the role of accident.
Why is it that racism has endured so long in every culture and continues even today in our so-called modern enlightened societies?
Racial distinctions are a part of the egotism that stimulates life. Everybody thinks his own color is the most wonderful. And if he didn't believe that, he'd lose a part of the stimulus that carries him along. And just the same way with you and me. If we didn't have a little vanity, we'd have less energy. We like to think that we're particularly special.
Well, we do indeed. And yet there has been a general intermixing of cultures here, for example, in the United States, and in the course of human history, has there not?
Yes, it's going on, yes.
So the racial ingredient, then, in the course of civilization, is just the product of egotism, or the biological competition that has always existed among organisms and species on our planet that you alluded to in an earlier talk.
Yes, I should say yes, simply yes. But I must not say simply yes. I must say yes, provided you remember that if you have a pride of race, it can be a strengthening stimulus. If you had no pride of race and the other fellow had pride of race, he might get the better of you just through that difference.
How have race and history been intertwined?
Well, it enters history as the operation of collective egotism. But whether the great achievements of history were due to the racial composition of the people that achieved these results is another question, because if there's anything clear in history, it is that civilization and greatness have appeared under all kinds of skin and under all sorts of nationalities. For example, take Confucius. He surely wasn't the same as a Kansas City Yankee, and yet he was a pretty great man, although the present Chinese don't quite agree with that, you know.
You make the observation that perhaps there were no great intellectual civilizations in Africa, where the blacks were. But perhaps if the population had been white, it wouldn't have made any difference. Is that correct?
Well, the populations of Africa were subject to biological laws. Many of them were living in conditions that did not permit any development of what we call civilization, namely the graces and the arts and sciences and philosophies of life. They were too busy surviving, just brutal survival. And so they discarded all clothing if they could, and they armed themselves because they had to defend themselves at every minute of the day almost. So what chance did they have? I defined civilization at the beginning of the 11 volumes as social order promoting cultural creation. The Central Africa got social order, but it didn't have much chance for cultural creation.
Well, then that's almost a contradiction of your definition, because you presuppose that if you got social order, it would automatically promote civilization. Now you say they got social order, but they didn't get civilization.
Well,
how can they get social order without utilizing it towards some effort of higher civilization?
I don't say that every social order produces cultural creation. I said civilization is social order when it produces cultural creation.
I think that's begging the question that way, because at first you made us think that if we got ourselves in condition to have social order, bumped each other's head until we had some sort of unifying meaning of life, that therefore we would get, so to speak, creation. Now, I don't know where we are.
Of course, the word cultural creation is a prejudice. Who is to determine whether it is a creation or not? The Central African might say we have produced a great many things which we consider to be cultural creations, like songs, the little tattoos that we carve into our sticks and so on. Well, these are our arts, and the fact that they are different from yours, it doesn't mean that they are not cultural creation. We have magnificent songs. They would call it cultural creation. In short, all writing is prejudice.
What do you mean when you say that society is founded not on ideals, but on the nature of man?
Society is founded on the nature of man in this sense, that by nature he is intended for the brute struggle for existence according to his individual powers. But by society, he is intended to check those individual instincts in order to be a social being.
I catch that. One wonders, have we changed?
Well, I should say the basic lesson of history is that man is essentially what he has been all through history. And he changes his habits, but he does not change his instincts. And his instincts, that is those tendencies of behavior that we seem to have with us in our blood from heredity. There's a great deal of discussion, of course, as to whether there are any instincts or not. But I have not placed much confidence in the theory that we have no instincts. No. Obviously, acquisitiveness is instinctive.
So you don't see that human nature has changed in the course of history?
Human behavior has changed, but not human nature. And consequently, the basic responses of man are the same: sexual, commercial. He's the same sort of person. The French are just the Greeks revived. The the Germans or the Lacedaemonians revived and so on. They behaved about the same way as those ancients did.
Who are we revived then?
We are the Romans. We are the Romans who imported Greek civilization. We imported European civilization. And our chief function in history is apparently to be a transmission line for that great heritage.
If we met someone who was wandering through the desert of 4,000 years ago, would he be like us? Would we be like him? Would he react to things in the same way?
He would be competing for his next meal and his next mate. Those are the essential things in our lives, too. I don't mean to say that all the activities of human beings are exactly the same as they were 2,000 years ago or 20,000. You know, history is only about 20,000 years old. It's a moment, and human history is just a moment in the history of the planet. I mean, 20,000 years ago, it's like saying that the last minute of the day is half the day. It isn't. It's just the last minute.
In terms of what makes the difference, you have a line in the book that intellect is a vital force in history, but it can also be a destructive power. What does that mean?
It becomes an instrument for justifying impulse. Namely, you become smart, you can prove that what you really want to do, what you are itching to do, is just what should be done. Haven't you ever done that in your life?
Always.
Always. The difficulty is that the intellect is an individualist. It learns how to protect the individual, and long before it ever thinks of protecting the group. That has to come later. It comes with the maturing of the mind. And consequently, a civilization controlled by the intellectuals would commit suicide very soon. Sure.
That's a slap against yourself. You don't have to be so mean to yourself.
I'm not an intellectual.
What then are you, a plebeian?
An intellectual, I suppose, is a man who mistakes ideas for realities.
No, that's selling them short. That's not my idea of an intellectual.
I'm trying to submit my ideas to reality. Of course, I may fool myself, but the only way to do it is by subjecting your ideas to the course of history.
How do you do that?
I read my books.
Ah, you see
or
that?
your books.
I thought so.
Why do you think we've been operating for the last 40, 50 years, trying to find out how has man really behaved?
Haven't certain individuals, the genius, great man, or hero, as Carlyle believed, been the prime determinants of human history?
There are many cases, I think, in which individual characters have had a very significant results upon history. But basically, I think Carlyle was wrong. That is, the hero is a product of a situation rather than the result being a product of the hero. It is demand that brings out the exceptional qualities of men. Mm-hmm. What would Lenin have been if he had remained in, was it Geneva? He would have been a little scribbler. But he faced tremendous demands upon him, and something in him responded. I think those demands would have brought out capacity in many different types of people. They wouldn't have to be geniuses to begin with.
Then what is the function or role of heroes?
They form the function of meeting a situation whose demands aroused all his potential abilities.
What do you think is the important thing for us in studying the course of history to know about character? What is the role of character in history?
I suppose the role of character is for the individual to rise to a situation. If it were not for the situation, we would never have heard of him. So that you might say that character is the product of an exceptional demand by the situation upon human ability. I think the ability of the average man could be doubled if it were demanded, if the situation demanded. And so I think Lenin was made by the situation. Of course, he brought ideas, but he had to abandon almost all those ideas. For example, he went back to private enterprise for a while.
Could you give me a definition of civilization as you perceive it?
Well, we defined it on the very first page of volume 1 of the story as social order promoting cultural creation. Social order, I suppose, means a combination of order and liberty. Those two seem to be both necessary to the basis from which all the flowers of civilization grow: the literature, the art, the science, the philosophy, the music, the morals.
And yet they would seem to be at odds. Very often order and liberty or freedom seem to be in conflict with one another.
Civilization is a subtle collaboration and balance between order and liberty. If order is too great, liberty is stifled. If order is too little, liberty becomes license, so that it becomes a matter of automatic wisdom in both of them to adjust each to the other. Perhaps at the present time, liberty has the upper hand.
Do you think at this juncture that liberty is gaining the ascendant and has the upper hand over order?
Yes. I suppose, for example, the family, the school, the church, even the state, they have lost their efficacy, probably because the basis of all of them was religious belief, which has been enormously weakened.
Well, how do you account for that, the weakening of religious belief?
Oh, well, it's been going on ever since Copernicus discovered that we were just a drop in an ocean of planets. And we began to wonder, how is it that we became so important to God? Why did he choose this particular bit of mud as his home on Earth? And of course, that was the beginning of it with Copernicus. What is it, about 1560? And then if you jump 400 years to Charles Darwin, you get another blow that was struck at our old beliefs, namely the revelation that we belonged to the animal kingdom and had a great deal of the animal left in us.
And yet there are many people who would suggest that the animal in us is rather more civilized, by any more reasonable definition of the term, than the human. More civilized in the sense of being more at home with other animals and at home with its environment. Civilized man is extremely uncivilized, don't you think?
Well, from another standpoint, you can say remarkably civilized. I mean, civilization itself is the most remarkable thing that has ever happened on the planet, from our point of view. Certainly the most remarkable thing that man has done. But the trouble is that it requires a perpetual, delicate balance of the social impulses with the animal impulses. After all, you see, we have a general idea that man was a hunter for hundreds of thousands of years. He's been an agriculturalist, a tiller of the soil, only for some 30,000 years, so far as we know. And it was in the agricultural regime that our social impulses were encouraged and developed.
That's really the origin of civilization.
The origin of civilization was the agricultural development of the home and the social impulses. And a civilization is always a perilous balance between the social and the individual impulses. In the hunting stage, we had to be individualists. Well, there was a family, or a narrow family perhaps, but there was the picture that we have of man in those days, which may have lasted hundreds of thousands of years, that hunting stage. Generally, the biologists or the sociologists picture man as having lived at least 1 million years. And of those 1 million years, at least 300,000 were in the stage of hunting.
Yes.
The agricultural, relatively short period. And in the hunting stage, we had to be animals almost. We had to be individualists. We had to go out with a club and be ready to fight our way to some food that we wanted to get. We had to face an animal sometimes and conquer it before we could eat it. And we ate it almost on the spot because we could never tell what would happen. And similarly, the man being a hunter was acquisitive, he was pugnacious, and he was sexually almost lawless. And those qualities were necessary. They were virtues in the hunting stage. I should define a virtue as a quality that makes for survival.
Survival then becomes one of the highest attainments of man.
Yes. But in agriculture, those hunting qualities of pugnacity, aggressiveness, sexual veracity, which were once virtues because they were necessary to survival, they became problems. We needed them still in some degree to give vigor to human life and activity. But we had to develop institutions to mitigate those hunting qualities. And that is the problem, the persistent problem of civilization, is by what institutions have we been able to mitigate those hunting qualities so that they might be useful but not excessive, not dangerous to us. And we had to develop social impulses, which were partly in our blood in the sense that we inherit the affection of a man for a woman, perhaps the family. You might say that they are biologically rooted. But civilization is not biologically rooted. It depends upon the development of the mind, educational systems. It depends upon religious belief. It depends upon social organization through the community and the state. And none of these was known to the hunter.
But you yourself have challenged some of the prevailing religious beliefs of our time.
Well, that was in my youth. Today, I should say that I know much less than I did then. And I would not be so forward as to stand up and judge a religion, because a religion is a product of hundreds and thousands of years, the way Christianity is. And I have learned that it is very dangerous for an individual to think that his own individual mind can stand up and, with the experience of some 30 or 40 years, judge the experience of the race, which is that without supernatural beliefs, it's very difficult to control the animal instincts in us. And it may be that all through history, religions have helped society to control those animal instincts to enable the social instincts to cope with them and to make civilization possible. I suppose it is the attempt to control in a society, the instincts that were developed in the hunting period of man, which has been enormously longer than his agricultural period. And civilization is a product of agriculture. Yes. I don't know whether we can use the historical relationship to illustrate the function of morals, but basically the function of morals is to overcome the aggressive instincts of mankind that were stimulated in the hunting periods of centuries, to overcome those impulses by social impulses that are generated in the family. And in each civilization, I think behind all the brilliant male characters, the philosophers and the generals and the warriors, the basic process going on was women bringing up children, trying to develop in them the qualities learned in a family, not on the stage or on the battlefield. On the battlefield, the necessary quality is to kill or be killed. In civilization, the necessary quality is to make accommodations or be isolated.
But morality rests upon the function of women. That is a function performed by women. Is it to induce a moral sense in the family?
No, I think woman is the basic transmitter of morals, but she does not fulfill the real function of morals, which is to produce order out of natural chaos in all the fields of human life. We have morals that apply to economics, for example. Thou shalt not steal. It has not much to do with the family, but it has a great deal to do with the economic order. And thou shalt not kill. And all these, most of the commandments were not for the family, they were for the group. And the evolution of morals has been the enlargement of the area to which the commands apply, to pass from the narrow family to the tribal family, or tribal group, and to the community, to the state, to the nation.
You don't see any revival of interest in morals, in a moral code.
Well, in a sense, yes. It seems to me that the young people that I see today are better organized morally than the young people of my youth. They are better reconciled to marriage and to parentage. They don't say with Catherine Hepburn years ago that marriage is a gyp. They don't try to avoid parentage. They want to have not only one child, but 3 or 4. I find all sorts of happy marriages around me, and so that indeed I've seen so many good people in my life that I've almost lost my faith in the wickedness of mankind. In short, there is, I think, a more wholesome attitude, but the trouble is maybe I'm wandering in a different set than I used to, you see. It's hard to judge. Maybe I've raised myself from the people who are disorganized to the people who are organized.
Could America be going through a period of moral disintegration?
It is possible, yes. Religious codes are uncongenial to human nature. They run against our most powerful instincts. They are usually, the moral code is usually made strong enough to handle those instincts by being bound up with powerful religious beliefs. When the religious beliefs weaken, the moral code loses, you might say, its supernatural supports. It becomes then a calculus of expediency, more or less. And usually in history, the moral life of a people deteriorates along with the weakening of its religious belief. Now, this is not an apology for religion. I am not discussing whether a religion is right or wrong. I don't know. But usually there is that association in history. You can see it in Moses coming down from Sinai with the 10 Commandments. If he had said to his people, I, Moses, give you these commandments, they would have sent him about his business. He had to say, the Lord saith, God gives you these commandments. He knew that he had to make this uncongenial code part of the religious belief, or else it wouldn't be strong enough to buck up against their instincts. See? In short, society is based on social order, which is based on character and moral discipline, which is usually associated with religious belief. And consequently, when the religious belief weakens,
as it has in this country,
I think so, then the moral life tends to become a little more disorderly.
This has happened to all civilizations that have disappeared?
Well, it's quite clear that it happened in Greece, quite clear that it happened in Rome. It's happened in France in our time. It may be happening to the United States at the present moment. It's a terrible question to ask. Is there any escape from these developments? I sometimes think that the decline of religious belief is far more important an event today than the communist challenge or the terrific struggle between different economies. How trivial that seems compared with the question, is Christianity dying? Do you ever think of that? Is that an awful thought? But if it is dying, the moral code that it supported will lose an immense support on which it depended. And if the moral life disintegrates, the civilization to which it gave social order will have quite a problem to handle.
Well, getting to that in your chapter on morals and history, you say that sin has flourished in every age. So is sin basic to man?
It's always in every age, the individualistic instincts are more powerful than the social instincts. That is, the individualistic instincts are those that protect the individual for survival. The social instincts are those that counteract those individualistic instincts and operate for the protection of the group. See, for example, when I join a club that overcomes a purely individualistic attitude, even when I vote, more or less it does that. The definition of sin, I suppose, is the overcoming of the social by the individual impulses.
Well, how does that reflect itself in what we think of as everyday behavior?
Then the question of sin would not be involved.
Sin would not be involved?
No, taking your glasses off your nose is not a sin.
Right.
And obviously the word sin would be irrelevant. The word sin is relevant only in the context of the individual versus the group, and his individualistic instincts versus his group impulses.
But in theological terms, when they talk about sin...
That's another subject. I'm not an expert on that kind of sin. Namely, sin there would be a violation of the laws of God.
As interpreted by the priesthood.
Well, behave yourself.
Many philosophers have believed that human reason should be the sole arbiter of morality. Indeed, you even wrote a book on the age of reason. Did this experiment work? Do you agree that this was, in fact, an age of reason?
In the sense that it was an age of great philosophers. It was an age of what we call rationalism, namely the belief that reason should be the ultimate test of truth. That, I think, would be a fair definition of rationalism. It was an age of revolt against traditional beliefs, especially against traditional religious dogmas. And the age has received that name. Let us say the age from 1700 to 1900 has received the name the Age of Reason, because it included so many great philosophers like Descartes, Bacon, Hobbes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and then, of course, culminating in Voltaire and Diderot and the great encyclopedia of 1750, which attempted to subject the religious and his political beliefs of Europe to the test of reason. It created a great deal of disorder, of course. Now, whether I would call it an age of reason, yes, I think I would, but I would put the word reason in quotation marks and utter it with a smile, recognizing that there are many things profounder than reason, which should enter into a man's judgment and understanding of life, and yet would not come under the name reason. Sentiment, for example, tenderness, affection, mystery, these things that can hardly be reduced to any rational formula are just as important in our lives as reasoning. Reason is a tool, but character is based upon instincts and feelings into which reason seldom enters. And consequently, reason cannot be really the dominant aspect of any age or any man. It's an instrument.
I wonder why so many people decided to call it the Age of Reason then.
Because the philosophers themselves called it that at the time. They said that instead of determining truth by opening scriptures or by accepting the teaching of a church, they decided that they would determine everything by examining their own reason. It was a tremendous adventure because no individual mind, however brilliant, can ever safely sit in judgment on the traditions of mankind, because the traditions are the result of the trial and error thinking of hundreds of generations. So that every book of philosophy is an audacious, wild enterprise, an uncalculated risk. It's like a drop of water suddenly standing up on the crest of a wave and announcing that it is going to analyze the sea.
That's a wonderful analogy. Dr. Durant, you said it was an experiment, really, by the philosophers. Do you think it had a bad influence on us, their decision?
That's a profound question, and who am I to judge? You know, you'd have to be 300 years into the future, really, to judge. The Age of Reason was a good influence, I think, in the sense that it cleared up a great many absurdities, liberated us to think freely. On the other hand, it was a danger in the sense that it was immodest, that it did not warn us, while we were free to think, that we should be mighty careful about this freedom, because freedom is a trial, it's a terrific test, and in an ideal world it would be only commensurate with our intelligence. And when we made ourselves free, we forgot to make ourselves intelligent, and thereby perhaps hang many tales, including mine.
In your view, Dr. Durant, is morality a function of religion?
Not exactly, but it's a dependent upon religion. In that sense, it's not a function of religion. The function of religion is quite different, I think. It is to give man a belief that will enable him to tolerate life. It's a new definition, isn't it? To enable man to bear reality, that's the first function. Practically every religion in history has turned out to have been a delightful dream of happiness to come, or a delightful assumption that the individualistic instincts could be overcome by the social instincts. But the individualistic instincts were formed in the hunting stage through hundreds of thousands of years. The social instincts are formed in the agricultural stage, which is only 25,000 years old. They are weaker than the individualistic instincts, enormously weaker. The social instincts need support, and they get support from law, but law is not enough. Law visibly fails today in checking the individualistic instincts. And religion came to the rescue of law by teaching man that the individualistic instincts were contrary to the law of God. It depended upon belief in a God who saw everything and who could judge everything and could punish everything. And when the belief in that declines, this moral order loses one of its strongest supports. And that is the condition in which we are today.
Does studying history give you a great respect for religion or a lack of respect?
Terrific respect.
Why?
I made a great fuss about leaving the religion that was bequeathed to me by my French-Canadian parents. And looking back upon it, I see that basically they were right, and I was wrong. I was an individualist who felt that his little ideas, his studies were of sufficient depth and scope to be fit to sit in judgment upon the traditions of the race. And that was a mistake. I don't know what I would do now if I were in the same situation with the brilliant mind that I have at the present moment. But I would like to feel that I would give tradition a better deal than I gave it.
That's the eternal battle between youth and old age.
Yes.
If you leave it up to the old, they would take back everything they ever had the courage to do when they were young and virile. Yes. So that you must never trust an old man to be the judgment of youth. They would just nip it off before it ever expressed itself.
I feel destroyed.
Well, in every old man, there must be a boy still, I think.
No, sir, not still. A dead boy, yes.
Tradition is the memory of the race. Insanity is the loss of memory. That's the whole business, you see. Well, I'm putting Edmund Burke there in one line.
Is that Edmund Burke's?
He wrote the best analysis, I think, of conservatism, the philosophical basis of conservatism. In short, he believed that the brake was more important than the gas.
The brake more important than the gas. It depends on whose gas.
My daughter Ethel was suggesting I tell you the story about two great friends of mine, Ernest Renan and Henri Taine. Taine is spelled T-A-I-N-E. I used to pronounce him Taine. He wrote a magnificent history of English literature, despite the fact that he was a Frenchman. And no Englishman has ever yet equaled that history. However, that is not the point. In their old age, they began to feel that the share that they had played in attacking religious orthodoxy had been a destructive influence. They perceived that the theology which they had rejected had been a support to a moral code which had been almost worthless without the theology, namely the idea of the individual controlling his individualism in order to take into consideration the needs of the group that he belonged to. And Renan wrote to Taine inquiring why it was that he, Renan, and Taine, despite losing their Christian theology, had retained and been guided by the Christian ethic. And he said, we have been living on a shadow. But it worked with us because the ethic was warmed up, so to speak, by the theology. And the warmth remained, even when the theology went. But our children are being brought up on a Christian ethic no longer warmed by the Christian theology. They are living on the shadow of a shadow. You and I are living, nous vivons d'un ombre, we live on a shadow. But our children will live on the shadow of a shadow. Ils vivront d'un ombre d'un ombre. The basic process in the 19th century was not socialism, and the great figure was not Marx. It was Darwin. It was the dissolution of the theology that had been the support of the moral life, along, of course, with the agricultural regime, which had also been a great factor in the moral life, namely the father was the employer of the sons as well as the father of them. And the family was an economic unit and process. Now, that process has been going on right along, and in the light of it, you perceive how relatively unimportant was the Russian Revolution. It changed the ways of producing goods, but did it effectively replace the Christian ethic? That's the problem that they have to face. Suppose they develop rich and poor there, as we did here. Will they begin to wonder, what is the meaning of life if we have to struggle that others may have abundance? And then the individualism will reappear, especially if the communistic myth disappears in the face of history. What I mean is that they may discover that they haven't found utopia yet at all. And they will then be in the condition of Alfred de Musset's story of the peasant who said to Voltaire, "You told us to abandon heaven and build it here, and to give up our pitchforks and take up our guns and fight for a new life. We took you at your word. We have been defeated. We have to go back to our farms and our pitchforks. And now we are exploited just as much as before, and the heaven that you took from us, which was our consolation, is no longer with us, so that you have done one of the greatest crimes in history. You have taken our last resort from us."
Is the Bible a great document of history?
Of course, it's undoubtedly a treasure of practically everything, of history, of philosophy, everything except science. And science, after all, is limited to the external world. It hardly has any effect when you deal with the internal world. What is consciousness? Do you have any scientific answers to that?
No.
I believe in God, but I have my own definition. God, to me, is a creative force, wherever it appears and in whatever form. It might be in the growth of a little blade of grass between the cracks of a concrete sidewalk. Haven't you ever been moved by the sight of that? I looked at one day and I said, "My God, there's God." And of course, that creative force has all sorts of operations. I believe that it exists in the universe. I think everything is alive, basically, even matter. And that creative force running through matter and all the way up to Einstein, that's the God I believe in.
It's also been said quite often in our culture that God is love. Do you think God is love? What do you think of the relationship between love and God?
Love is a creative force too, but it's only one form of creative force. And it might be destructive, just as a sexual instinct can destroy a society. No, it has to be creative before I would call it divine. It doesn't have to be merely instinctive.
What do you think of that, Mrs. Durant?
Well, to tell you the truth, I haven't ever divided in my own mind, my own way of feeling. I have never divided love from the aspect of creation. I never thought there was creation without love, even if the love be, so to speak, inanimate or a not very visible element. But seems to me when two birds perched on a limb begin whispering to each other, there's love. It's in I imagine it's in everything that is alive.
Mm-hmm.
You also say in that chapter about religion that as long as there is poverty, there will be gods.
Yes, as long as there is poverty, there will be gods, because human beings need some consolation and some inspiration to hope. And if they are well fed and belong to the jet set, they don't feel the need of a God. But if they're working in the fields, the Angelus is a great consolation to them.
Still, the desire to thank somebody when something is great or good or marvelous or mysterious is natural and instinctive. And in that respect, I believe that we unconsciously believe in something bigger, greater than ourselves, which we may call God.
And to whom we wish to offer thanks.
That's right.
Has Marx removed God in vast areas of the world, really, or not?
I don't think so.
You mean socialistic movements have removed
Yes.
religious belief?
Yes. Have they in fact removed the deep belief?
I should say the other way, that the decay of religious beliefs has promoted socialistic movements. I was just reading Thucydides' Peloponnesian War again. It has a terrific chapter about the revolution in Corcyra. And there was such cruelty on both sides. And then you discover that practically everybody at that time had lost his religious belief. In the days of Pericles, you think Pericles took Zeus as a god? Zeus was a statue, and with a little gold in it, which could be used in a pinch, which they actually did use in the Peloponnesian War. But he didn't take religion seriously. And same way with Socrates, same way with Euripides. Euripides' dramas are full of agnosticism.
Well, I have to ask you, who would be your favorite character in history?
Oh my God.
Do you have such a thing?
Without any doubt, I would say Jesus Christ. Doesn't that sound funny? The old skeptic.
But that's
goes
not
back.
history.
Well, of course, he was part of history, wasn't he?
Well, you can't tell
Also,
whether he's just.
You don't mean to say he was a complete myth, do you?
Well, why do you say it?
Well, because he gave me ideals which appealed to me very much. I wish to God I could obey his ethical doctrine. I know it's impossible to human nature, but it's an enormously desirable as a counteraction to our natural individualism. For example, what it says, turn the other cheek. Well, it's silly, you don't turn the other cheek. But you try to behave without returning insult with insult or blow with blow. Say. How enormously important that is to living in a social order.
Dr. Durant, there seems to be more and more people going back to church these days. There's a return to religion in this country. What do you think?
I don't think that that is a religious revival. It's a church-going revival.
And so many wars have been based on Christianity versus other religions, or one sect of Christianity facing another, like in Ireland today.
But biology overcame religion. Man is a competitive animal, you see. Even religions compete. Even the various sects in a religion compete.
Do you think that we North Americans are getting closer to the Russians, and the Russians are getting closer to us? Is there a meeting place taking place, or are we splitting off?
Oh, yes. I think in all history, as Hegel would remind us, is a process in which a condition, which he calls a thesis, splits into opposing elements, as, for example, socialism and capitalism. And the third condition, synthesis, is a combination of the two opposing elements. When you go back to Hegel and beyond Marx, if Marx failed to make the last step in his analysis, he said, here's our economic woe. It's dividing the socialism and capitalism. Now, he should have said they will unite. He said, no, socialism will destroy capitalism. He was unfaithful to his old teacher, Hegel. Hegel would have said, you silly, I didn't teach you that. I would have said the third step is the synthesis of the previous steps. And that is what the world is coming to, a combination of capitalism and socialism.
Dr. Durant, is peace possible? Is it unrealistic to hope for world peace?
It's not unrealistic, provided you know that you're up against all the lessons of history. but it's a good thing to try for. Perhaps we improve conditions, even if we don't realize the complete elimination of war.
Has war ever really solved any basic problems?
No, it replaces one possessor by another, and he will be replaced by another, and so on, until the terrain is exhausted.
Until the terrain is exhausted, or until we've obliterated mankind. Do you think of that as a realistic possibility?
I don't think man will be obliterated by a war. We are obliterated by pestilence or earthquakes.
But not by a thermonuclear holocaust.
No, he will preserve to the last minute the pleasure of killing his brother.
Do you think that war ever serves a really useful purpose?
It may be in the sense that it exhausts the pugnacity of the participants.
As a siphon, then?
Yes, if they didn't have war, they'd do something else, which conceivably could be different, because in many centuries, war affected only a small part of the population. And there were certain rules about it that every gentleman observed. You remember the days when the English used to visit France, even when they were at war with France. They actually was. A man like Robert Walpole, who was the man who wrote all those famous letters, Horace Walpole. Yeah. Robert was the prime minister. But, Horace Walpole visited Paris when England was at war with France, I think. And there were several cases of that.
Of course, this was a highly civilized kind of manifestation in a time of limited warfare.
Yes.
Aha, the civilized rules of war.
Yes. Between you and me, the nicest warriors were the mercenaries, because they were paid to do a job, and they did as little of it as possible, and they had no objection to peace if they had been properly paid.
And we've become much more civilized now, to the point of unlimited total war, in which no such thing would be possible.
Yes.
While you were an instructor at Columbia University back in 1917, there were demonstrations against American entry into World War I. Today there are demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. Are the situations similar?
Well, similar and different. It's similar in the sense that young people naturally resent being sent off to war. Of course, in the Civil War, the reaction of the youth was even stronger than it is now, I think. But there was not, in 1917, any emphasis on the immorality of war. It was only on the tradition of America and its Monroe Doctrine to stick within our hemisphere. It was an isolationist emphasis. And the idea was that we should not get involved in European wars. Naturally, all that is now water under the bridge. We don't think in terms anymore of whether we should be in Europe or not. The youngsters feel that this kind of a war that we're fighting now has no moral justification. That doesn't mean that I feel that way, but I think that's the way they do feel.
The problem of liberty is at what point does it become excessive? At what point does it produce disorder? And I think it's easier to understand that question when you ask, have we not reached that point today? We will agree that we were oppressed by a great many compulsions before, and that it was desirable to overcome them. And we rejoiced at the growth of freedom. We turned our whole national psychology upon the idea of freedom. But when you consider that civilization is made possible by self-restraint, it is obvious that there must be a limit to freedom, because the self-restraint or the restraint will disappear. I think we have reached that point today. I think, between you and me, though I know they'll call me an old fogey for it, and they're probably justified, I think freedom has reached the point where it is creating order, creating disorder, and forgetting that order was its mother. It is destroying its mother.
So that freedom is really the product of order.
Yes, certainly. And you could be free if it didn't have a degree of order that keeps me from knocking you down, see? Besides other reasons.
Yes, there might be other reasons. But you can't then consider freedom without its relationship to order.
Correct.
And the limits imposed on the interests of order.
Freedom has to be moderated or it destroys itself. There's no question.
Who determines the limits?
Events.
Events. This is an impersonal process.
I think so, yes. Nobody comes along and says, now you have too much freedom. I'm going to take some of it away. We wouldn't allow that. We've reached the point where we are so free that we'll destroy anybody who attempts to limit our freedom. So we'll destroy ourselves.
In this chapter, you mentioned Plato and his scheme. Where would we fit into Plato's scheme today, politically?
We have rule by men who have succeeded in business and have learned how to meet problems, get around them somehow or other, and they are subject to the fourth form of government in Plato's description, which is democracy, ruled by the demos, the common man. Well, I'm not quite sure that the common man is ruling today. Common people never rule anything. But what we mean is that government has fallen more and more into the hands of the more and more common denominator of humanity. Not entirely. Obviously, the businessman is still at the realm today. He can order and get things done. The average man is still in a condition where he needs to be told what can be done and how to do it. And usually he appreciates getting information of that sort and following instruction. If he rebels entirely against order, he's an undeveloped individual and we'll have to forget about him. Now, what Plato does there is to express the view of an aristocrat about democracy, because he himself was born of a rich family. He never had to worry about his food. So he went on to describe what happens if the common man gets power. And you can see the result by looking first at what he does to manners. Manners disappear. What he does to literature, it deteriorates a little bit. What is poetry today? It's a medley of deliberately unintelligible lines.
Now you are not sounding very much like the socialist that you were some 50 or 60 years ago.
Nothing to do with socialism. I am arguing against formless behavior, the formlessness in life, in manners, in literature, in art. I detest meaningless art, but that has nothing to do with democracy or socialism. I just like meaning. I think an artist should have something to say and should tell us what it is, not splash a canvas with indiscriminate colors and rely upon the colors themselves to teach us significance.
So given the choice between an excess of liberty and an excess of order, you would lean in the direction of order.
Yes, because if you have excess order, you still have order. But if you have excess liberty, you have chaos.
So if you could tell me what art is in essence, I understand it to be a function of order. And if art is not orderly, then there is no art. That's the basis of your dissatisfaction, isn't it?
Art is freer than ever before, and so it is in chaos. And before your eyes, a man throws paint upon a canvas and thinks that that's art. Or he puts lines down, 15 lines, one like another. He gets thousands of dollars for that.
That's not art, that's chaos, in your judgment.
That's disintegration, I should say. Or when I ask an artist, what does that mean? He refuses to answer. He says, you have the right to ask me what it means. Well, I should say, if it didn't have any meaning, why did you do it? And he answers, because it is a pleasure in itself, and even the meaningless is beautiful. I don't agree with that. I think that the essence of beauty is order.
I see. So for you, order is primary in these matters.
No, freedom and order are equal in desirability. You can imagine that order can be excessive, and then you demand freedom. And to a certain extent, you're achieving a higher line. It was good that artists became free, that they were even, emancipated from following some great figure like Michelangelo, so that everybody was doing the same thing. But they went to the extreme of doing things to which you could apply no significance. You learned nothing from viewing them. And yet I think that the essence of art is the giving permanence to significance.
What I wonder is that we hear so much about the fact that perhaps American civilization is dying. Perhaps it's over. Perhaps it's on the way out. Is it? When I say American, I involve, of course, all Western civilization.
All Western civilization is in that situation. It has lost the religious basis of its moral code, and it is trying to operate on a natural ethic, except for those good people who still have the old beliefs, and I think they are helped a great deal by those beliefs. But as you will agree, the effective part of the population is the one that has the least theology, isn't it? I mean, the higher you go in the intellectual scale, the less the old creed remains. And that is a basic fact in our society. As Toynbee said, we are living in the post-Christian era. Okay? Many civilizations that we know of have had obvious periods of growth and obvious periods of decay, or have then disappeared. But whether it's a cyclical process is open to question. As you know, many of the great thinkers on that subject, like Spengler, Vico, have had different notions of the cycles. I was interested to find that a socialist about 1780 conceived a plan according to which he felt all civilizations developed. They first had an organic, they had a critical stage in which they discussed what should be done. It took 200 or 300 years to discuss. And then an organic period in which they had made up their minds. And then that would collapse, and it would collapse as criticism resurrected. And so it had another age of criticism, and so on. So he thought the Middle Ages were a stable age of organic unity and development. From 1500 years until now, we have a critical stage in which the mind knocks to pieces any positive idea that you can give.
Beginning with the Renaissance and Reformation.
The Renaissance perhaps criticized the whole medieval view and wanted to go back to the classics. The Reformation also wanted to make a change, but strange to say, it went back to many medieval ideas, like St. Augustine, for example, more than any other of the fathers of the church. And in a sense, that was a return to old ways as a way of getting away from Rome.
I guess this is why I think of the whole concept of growth and decay in terms of cycles, because so much of what is new, critical, innovative, and that seems to represent a turning point of history, looks back.
Well, I think we can agree with Saint-Simon that there are organic ages and there are critical ages. Obviously, we live in a critical age. Indeed, we are busily occupied in tearing our traditions and our foundations to pieces.
In the name of freedom.
Yes, of course, the age of criticism is an age of freedom. The age of order is an age of stability.
Dr. Durant, do you think that history repeats itself?
In the large, but not in detail. For example, all civilizations begin with clearing a wilderness, developing agriculture, maybe conquering a possessing population as we conquer the Indians. It passes on to developing industry, developing organizations of finance. And then, when it has built its economic base, it begins to produce cultural activities, literature, art, science, philosophy. It usually has strong religious beliefs at the beginning. And as the civilization develops science and philosophy, those beliefs run into conflict with what is supposed to be the progress of knowledge. Then there is a terrific struggle which may unsettle the moral base of the civilization, because the moral basis is usually tied up with religious belief and instruction. And then two things can happen. One or the other of them happens to every civilization. Either the civilization decays from within through moral disintegration, which may be happening to us at this minute, or there is a change of trade routes which leaves the country off the direct line of communication and wealth. That may be happening to England now in the air age. You see, it belonged to the maritime era. But the air age means going directly to your goal, which will leave England off the main line. So that in the large, civilizations go through the same stages. But naturally, the details are different. We know, for example, that every religion will change in the course of time. We have a general idea how it will change. We know what will happen to the civilization itself. It is bound to die sometime.
You think so?
Of course. American civilization, like any other, is a transitory thing. It's a moment in geological time. Isn't that a mean thing to say, that American civilization is a moment in geological time? And so, by the way, is literary immortality, so that when you speak of Shakespeare as immortal, you realize that that's just between one ice age and another. Now, the details will be enormously different. You can have automobiles instead of push carts. You can have radios instead of the letters of Madame de Sévigné. But the details are rather unimportant in determining the future of a civilization. I mean, the fact that we have automobiles instead of horses doesn't determine our future. The fact that we have radios instead of reading my books doesn't determine the future. Those are incidentals. The essential things to America are, will the moral life of the American people survive the enormous test that it is undergoing from the growth of intellect and the weakening of inhibitions? And will it survive changes in trade routes and the discovery of raw materials and so forth? Imagine that Russia and China, for example, prove geologically far richer than this continent. That will have an enormous influence on the history of America in the future.
Looking ahead, I must ask this question. Do you feel pessimistic or optimistic, having studied history so long? What is your basic feeling? Are you an optimist about the future, or are you a pessimist?
No, I think the words pessimist and optimist should be kicked out because they are both extremes. You never meet an optimist. The word optimist should mean who believes that things are the best possible things. best possible condition. Optimist means the best, doesn't mean the good. And pessimist means the worst. The pessimist is supposed to be a man who believes that things are as bad as they could be. You don't find that sort of a person anywhere. I'm a realist. I accept life as composed of difficulties and delights. And I accept the difficulties as a natural price of existence, and I accept the delights as goodies which I really don't deserve. Take this, for example. I never dreamed in my youth that I would have this delightful surroundings in which to decay.
Well, are we progressing or regressing? Are we going ahead or are we going backward?
It's hard to use those terms. We're changing. We are changing from one social order to another one. I suspect that we will go on with our pagan period until a great social calamity comes, like a war or a great earthquake or something, when the cities will be destroyed and men will be driven back to till the soil for their living. Then some religion will reappear. It could be the old one. I could imagine Christianity reappearing. It's done devilish things, but it has been basically beautiful. We should never use the word progress to imply progress in everything. Obviously, we are progressing in some things and retrogressing in others. Personally, with my prejudices, I would say that we are retrogressing in manners, for example, but we are progressing in the ability to cover space, and we have made enormous conquests with the airplane. I enjoy and honor all these things, but the things that we want to do change from generation to generation. Maybe we are not as interested in making beautiful statues as we used to be, and consequently I would not expect contemporary sculpture to rival the great sculptors of ancient Greece or Rome. Although I must say, I would have said the same thing if I had lived in Rodin's day, and then I would have been surprised to find Rodin.
It's a very interesting question whether we really have a good sense of the quality of our own age. Do you think it is possible to get a perspective on one's own age?
Well, we don't know enough about other ages. We usually know more about their achievements than about their faults. And we know more about our faults than about our achievements. We tend to play our achievements down because they were done by somebody else.
You've stated that human nature hasn't changed. The man made himself free, but forgot, you said, to make himself intelligent. But I could say it in your words another way. He forgot to change his nature.
Yes. Yes, I think by and large, human nature does not change in the historic period. It may have changed in the biological career of man, let us say from the old Stone Age, 50,000 years before Christ. Though, again, it's very hard to tell because all that we have of the old Stone Age is bones. We can hardly tell what sort of nature they had. So that while I might admit that human nature changes, I should say it changes with geological leisureliness, and that you can assume without going far wrong that it hasn't changed in the last 2,000 years. I find that the Greeks were anxious to do the same things that we are anxious to do. They were anxious to get power, anxious to get wealth, anxious to get women, and I suspect that we are similarly anxious today. We use slightly different means. Progress is an improvement in the means that we use for achieving the same old ends. And I sometimes wonder whether the progress is only of means without any progress in ends. Do we desire the same things that we used to desire thousands of years ago? Do we merely achieve them with different instrumentalities, radios, for example, automobiles? Once we wanted to put our arm around a girl. Well, we did it on a sofa. Sofas are out of date today. We go out into the byways and do it in a car or in a drive-in theater. But it's only the means that have changed. The desire is the same.
People do say that human nature has changed. Human nature has improved in the past few hundred years. You don't agree?
No, there's no sign of improvement in human nature. We're just as cruel, just as acquisitive, just as excited men about women. Do women get excited about men? I don't see much evidence of it. But if I may speak for men, we still get excited about women, even at the age of 72. And that goes on from century to century without any basic change. And those basic impulses are the things that determine our lives.
So, from the standpoint of the historian, you see no change in human nature.
I'm quite confident of that.
We're the same. The environment's different, but basically the nature's the same.
Very good. The biological factors remain unchanged. The social factors change. When I was born, I think I was born with the same impulses and nature that men were born with 50,000 years ago. The only difference is that there was a greater social heritage that I might absorb. There was an immense accumulation of intellectual advances, of moral restrictions, of aesthetic achievements, music and art. All those things were laid at my feet when I was born, but I was the same savage at birth that Neanderthal man was, but he didn't have this heritage. And if I become different from him, it is in the course of the individual life after birth. It's not that my nature has changed, it's my acquisitions have, let's say, grown.
Then there really is some credit due us.
Yes.
Maybe all the more credit due us since our basic nature is the same.
That's right.
And we've learned to handle our environment in such a way that we have softened the exterior of our basic nature. Maybe we deserve even more credit. Or have we?
We become civilized by absorbing civilization, but we don't become civilized by nature. Human nature is uncivilized. It's almost contra civilization. By nature, we are so pugnacious and acquisitive and erotic that you need all kinds of inhibitions and restraints and moral codes to make us civilized. And these things, of course, are acquired in the lifetime of the individual. They are not a native gift.
And we do try now to acquire more of those than past civilizations did. Is that true?
Yes, the technique of disseminating the heritage and of absorbing it has grown immensely. Consequently, an individual today can become much more learned than Aristotle because the heritage has grown since Aristotle. He can inherit the Renaissance and all its great artists, which Aristotle couldn't do, and so forth. In short, the pedestal on which we are born grows with the years. We are the same at birth that we used to be, but in a sense we progress by the rise of the pedestal of the social heritage. Sounds a little obscure, doesn't it? But you can see just from a history of civilization the enormous wealth of the heritage. I always feel awe-stricken when I think of how many things the past has offered me. How rich is this gift that it puts at my door when I emerge from the womb.
In the last page of that book, I fall into a kind of religious rhapsody about the heritage. And it has served me as a substitute for my religious belief. Namely, can you spare the book and see if I can read this? This is the heart of Will Durant right here. consider education not as the painful accumulation of facts and dates and reigns, nor merely the necessary preparation of the individual to earn his keep in the world, but as the transmission of our mental, moral, technical, and aesthetic heritage as fully as possible, to as many as possible, for the enlargement of man's understanding, control, embellishment, and enjoyment of life. The heritage that we can now more fully transmit is richer than ever before. It is richer than that of Pericles, for it includes all the Greek following that followed him. Richer than Leonardo's, for it includes him and the Italian Renaissance. Richer than Voltaire's, for it embraces all the French Enlightenment and its ecumenical dissemination. If progress is real, despite our whining, it is not because we are born any healthier, better, or wiser than infants were in the past, but because we are born to a richer heritage, born on a higher level of that pedestal which the accumulation of knowledge and art raises as the ground and support of our being. The heritage rises, and man rises in proportion as he receives it. History is, above all else, the creation and recording of that heritage. That's my answer to Voltaire's definition. Progress is the increasing abundance, preservation, transmission, and use of that heritage. To those of us who study history, not merely as a warning reminder of man's follies and crimes, which again was Gibbon's definition, but also as an encouraging remembrance of generative souls. The past ceases to be a depressing chamber of horrors. It becomes a celestial city, a spatial country of the mind, wherein 1,000 saints, statesmen, inventors, scientists, poets, artists, musicians, lovers, and philosophers still live and speak, teach and carve and sing. If a man is fortunate, he will, before he dies, gather up as much as he can of his civilized heritage and transmit it to his children. And to his final breath, he will be grateful for this inexhaustible legacy, knowing that it is our nourishing mother and our lasting life.
Very beautiful.
Alma mater.
Amen.
Our nourishing mother. That is just what the phrase means, of course. When you graduate from the college, you call it your alma mater. But alma means elementary. You're feeding, you're nourishing mater, mother. You're nourishing mother. That's what the heritage is.
Looking at history as a whole, Dr. Durant and Mrs. Durant, are ideas stronger than weapons, or is history made in the barrel of a gun?
Ideas are the strongest things of all in history, because even a gun was originally an idea. Somebody discovered gunpowder, for example. Somebody discovered a mechanism for discharging it. All these things were ideas.
At the other hand, an idea could, however important it might be at history, at a certain propitious time, it may lay dead and fallow for centuries, having no influence and no meaning at all, so that the idea is in itself that important until the idea meets the personality and the zeitgeist, the time spirit. When those three unite, you've got something going.
The ideas of today are the politics of tomorrow, and the philosophy of today is the literature of tomorrow. You can see, you're familiar with French literature, how the influence of Nietzsche pervaded the whole generation of Sartre and Camus and Gide. Not so much Proust, but there's another example. How the influence of Schopenhauer went all through the literature from 1860 to 1960. So that ultimately it's ideas. Think of the number of things that were ideas in our youth and that are now realities. All sorts of welfare legislation were bruited in my youth. Poor old Norman Thomas has probably had more of his ideas realized by elected officials than any other person alive today.
Today there seems to be more concern on American campuses about world and domestic problems. Is this a healthy sign?
A certain amount of rebellion has always existed. The discrepancy between the generations makes the development, each one in its own process, a little alien to the other. In other words, youth will always have desires that those who have outlived youth are beyond and can hardly remember or understand as they themselves have entered middle age or old age. Therefore, rebellion is natural. But how do we keep the foreign political and other country enemies out who have sent their provocateurs who are arousing youth for something that youth would not by itself and its own development be in need now? I understand and sympathize with the rebellion of youth. I dislike the alien elements that is using this rebellion of youth to make our country a chaotic process, into a chaotic process.
May I say a word about that? If there's one thing we ought to learn from history, it is that every generation rebels against the preceding one, and that therefore the preceding one should not take it too seriously. It's traditional that the young should rebel against the old, and as Ariel said, it's natural and desirable. Consequently, I don't think we should take it as seriously as we do. We can be sure that according to history, these young fellows will be getting jobs, they will be earning more money, they will be voting the Democratic ticket, they'll be voting then the Republican ticket, and after a while Hoover will be too radical for them. But in old age, which is hard to locate, let's say according to the Income Tax Bureau, after 65, there is another element that comes in, an element of acceptance. It's not resignation. It's chiefly, I think, understanding. For example, in old age, you understand how good it is that there should be radicals, and how good it is that there should be conservatives, that the radicals supply the wind, no pun intended, they supply the gas, again, no pun intended, and the conservatives supply the brakes. And both of those functions are indispensable. There is a tension there between youth and old age which creates the vitality of a society, so that the old man does not have to feel useless. He's fulfilling a very necessary function. If we were young but knew as much as we later knew, of course it's an impossible supposition. But you remember the old French adage, what was it, si jeunesse savait,